Thank you. It's my great privilege to introduce to you tonight's lecturer, Aaron Betsky. Aaron Betsky is an intellectual whose interventions are fairly global in reach. He has recently taken the helm as the dean of the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture at Taleisin as of Saturday, is that? And will serve as the director of the Shenzhen B-City Biennale of Urbanism and Architecture in Shenzhen, China. Dean Betsky received his MA at the Yale School of Architecture and also accumulated a BA in history from Yale along the way. He's taught at the University of Cincinnati in Kentucky, was the Eero Saarinen Chair at the Taubman School of Architecture and Urban Design, and has been a member of the Urban Council in Skolkovo, Russia since 2010.
It's a bit then.
Okay. Actually, in my notes it says since 1910. I thought that's not right. Dean Betsky is an extremely prolific and influential author. He is a contributing editor at Architect Magazine, and some of you may have read his recent article, What It Means to Make Good Architecture, in which he argues for both a sustainable and populist architecture that is not beholden to the elite of either taste or money. Some of his previous books that you may know are At Home in a World of Sprawl, The United Nations Building, and False Flat. Two of his books, Building Sex in 1995 and Queer Space in 1997, remain some of the most important books that we have about the relationship between architecture and sexuality today. Dean Betsky's new book, What is Modernism, is out this spring. Maybe. And without further ado, I turn you over to Aaron Betsky.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a wonderfully idiosyncratic selection of the various weird things that I've done in my life. There's a couple of other things I've done as well, but I'm not sure if they're more or less important, so we have to smatter. Good evening. Thank you for coming. I realize that I'm following Marlon Blackwell, and we had Marlon Blackwell in Cincinnati 2 weeks ago, so I know I have a tough act to follow, since he is doing probably some of the most interesting buildings of any practice in the United States, to say the least. Although I really like his early buildings more. That's another discussion. So I'm not going to show you that many buildings. So if you just want to see a lot of the sexiest, best buildings that have been done in the last few years, you might want to go back to the drafting room and work on your project. I'm going to, in fact, make an argument, which is an argument I've been making at least since I did the 2008 Biennale in Venice, the 11th International Architecture Biennale of Venice, that we need to be clear that architecture is not building. Now that might sound odd to some people, that might sound contradictory, but on the other hand, I thought at least that it was a very simple statement, which is to say that buildings are buildings. We're sitting in a building, I think, and building is a verb, it's to make buildings. Architecture is everything that is about buildings. It's how we see buildings, how we understand buildings, how we draw or represent buildings, how we think about buildings, how we discuss them. But it is not the buildings themselves. And in fact, the irony is that even though by that very definition, a building is the most succinct and fullest manifestation of architecture, it is also very difficult to find architecture within a building. Now, usually at this point in my explanation, I say, so if in this room I asked you where is the architecture, you would have a hard time figuring it out. Of course, in this case, it's a little less difficult because the architecture is pumping its muscles so hard to make itself evident. But that's also because most of us here have a fair amount of knowledge about architecture. But if we brought in a layperson and we had to say, what is the architecture in this room, we would have to begin speaking about the proportions, the angles, the idiosyncratic use of the angles, the way it creates a vessel-like shape, and pretty soon their eyes would glaze over. Because of course, what makes this architecture is inherent in the manipulation of built form in a manner that is extremely abstract and is extremely difficult to extract from the act of building itself. What's even more difficult these days, and what makes the discussion also interesting for me, and by the way, I should also say by way of out, that I said I wasn't going to talk about buildings. That's because I ain't got no buildings to show you. I'm a failed architect. I'm trained as an architect. I worked for people like Frank Gehry, and I can point to a couple of ramps and a few rooms in Frank Gehry buildings that I can say I really did that. But I'm not working as a practicing architect, so everything I'm going to tell you is also an excuse for why I'm not a practicing architect. So take that along with what I'm about to say. So anyhow, the big problem that as architects we have to face today is that not only is it very difficult to find and define architecture within building, but these days it's much more difficult to make architecture with buildings. Which is why, as Frank Gehry said, 98% of what is done by architects is shit. I'm quoting here so I can use that word. Not only is that because most architects out there are incompetent, and some of them might even be evil, but because buildings are defined these days almost completely by code. By building codes, by life safety codes, and what's probably even more important than that, by financial codes, which say that for any building, you have to invest as little as possible into its construction and get that investment out as soon as possible. So everything that smacks of architecture gets value engineered out of the building as quickly as possible. And then, of course, buildings are also defined by codes of behavior, normative codes, codes of what they're supposed to look like, codes that are embedded. A critic of some of my writing recently claimed they're embedded in our DNA, which I just thought was the bizarrest thing I ever heard. But certainly they're encoded in our culture in terms of what we expect buildings to do. All of that makes it very difficult to make architecture out of buildings. At the same time, there's architecture all around us. There's architecture in the movies and on television, where there's much greater freedom to imagine other spaces and to create critical alternatives. There's architecture in painting, in sculpture, in all kinds of forms of art. And what's most galling to architects, I think, is that there's a huge amount of architecture in interiors. Interiors have always been looked down on by architects, historically because they were, if they were done professionally, done by women. And the male architects all thought that women were inferior, and so what they did have to be inferior. But in reality, interiors are where you have much greater freedom, and this is in a sense an interior job, to create an architecture that is critical, that is evident, that has a life of its own. For that is what is interesting to me. You have to then ask the question, why make architecture? What are you doing with architecture? What is architecture all about? And you can come up with many, many different definitions, but I am quite simply, I think, interested in an architecture that makes the human-made world better. Which is to say, we live in a world that we have all made together over the centuries and the millennia. We have almost completely crowded out the world that nature has made, in which we've established ourselves. That human-made world around us is bad. It is bad visually, aesthetically, which is not unimportant. It is bad environmentally, using up natural resources that we cannot afford to deplete. And it is bad socially. It is imprisoning and divisive. It provides access only to a limited amount of people for limited activities. We need to figure out through architecture, which is the manipulation of built form, we need to figure out how to make our world better. We need to figure out how to make it more sustainable, more open, and more beautiful. That's what interests me about architecture. And I think that the way in which we can do that, the way in which we can make the human-made world better, is using the tools and the knowledge of architecture, which is different than the tools and knowledge and experience of painting and sculpture and film or interiors or any other field, to make that world better. And that means that we must look for architecture wherever it is transformative, or at least, as a beginning point, begins to question, open up, make more sustainable the world all around us. So what I'd like to show you this evening is a brief survey of what I think the essential questions are, no less than that, and some experiments in which people are engaged around the world to make what I think of as architecture. All right, so, is there any way to get this any darker? I thought we were going to make this, well, I guess all the lights are off here. Is there any way to get these fluorescent things on the side now? That's better, okay. Such a beautiful image, you gotta see it. I love this website, I don't know if any of you know it, it's called ontheroofs.com. It's two very crazy Russian guys who break into buildings around the world, very tall buildings, and pose themselves and poise themselves on the edges of skyscrapers and take, by now, very slick photographs, because now they've gotten sponsored by Nike and Hasselblad and all kinds of things, so they're not really rebels anymore. But that sense that architecture is exhilarating exactly when it has that perspective of being at the precipice, at the very edge, is what interests me. That sense that, and I have to show this to make it clear, that I love architecture, because I've noticed when I've talked about these things before, people said, you just hate architecture. No, I love architecture, but I love it from this perspective that there is something exhilarating and hauntingly dangerous about what it is that we have made. This is the other kind of architecture that I really love. This is the other kind of ledge that I love. In Barcelona, when they wanted to make a park out of this rocky promontory with great views over the city that had been used as a World War II battle point or anti-aircraft point, and then had been occupied by people illegally who had built fairly substantial houses on it. They had a competition, and various people came up with the kind of horrible, overdone stuff like, no doubt that Sazaki's going to propose for this university, and these kind of really overdone landscape designs. But the project that won was a project that said, do nothing, or almost nothing. Remove those houses and structures that prevent us from occupying this space, from seeing this view, from being here. Manipulate what is left only so far as to provide access, perspective, perhaps a series of connections or a variety of different spaces. See architecture as doing what ontheroofs.com does, putting us in a particular place where we can see and understand, know the world around us in a social setting. So we have all grown up with this notion that architecture is the manipulation of pure forms, the play, of pure forms in light. We have grown up with the notion that we need to take the complexity of our lives, the reality of our bodies, our social constructs, of the smells and sights and sounds of everything around it, and reduce it to almost nothing, if I can conflate the two grand male heroes of 20th century architecture, to create these pure abstract forms. But we're beginning to realize that those forms in their abstraction cannot hold. Actually, we've known it for a while. We've come to realize that trying to find an abstract order that we can impose on the world all around us winds up imprisoning everyone, including ourselves, removing what is real about us, and replacing it with a potential utopia that never comes. We have spent hundreds of years now building up this incredibly elaborate vocabulary of architecture. And the fact that it is a vocabulary is in itself telling. It is a representation of what? Sometimes of nothing, but certainly of the values and standards and beliefs and needs of those people who have the power and money to construct buildings. Architecture has been, always will be, the attempt by the social, political, and economic elite to impose their structures quite literally on the world around them. Architects, in trying to accept that role, have tortured themselves and their creations to find ways in which those forms could escape from the communication of an order imposed on them as well, could look more like natural forms, could be so unstable as to question the structures they contained, could be contradictory or representative of something that might exist some point in the future. And everywhere around us today, we see the sight of a contorted, convoluted architecture. Now, don't get me wrong. It's sexy stuff. And it is very attractive stuff. I had one student who wrote a paper for me a couple of years ago when I asked everyone to write about what was going on in architecture. And the title of her paper was How Bjarke Ingels is Going to Save the World of Architecture. And maybe he is, because Bjarke Ingels has figured out better than just anyone else how to make buildings that are so complex and so enigmatic that they can remain buildings, that you cannot reduce to pure abstractions, nor can you reduce them to the representation of the power structures for which they're built. They slip and slide like the skateboarders he loves so much, away from authority and power, and try to do something else. But boy, do they have to work hard to do that. And of course, he's not the only one. The very best, which is to say the most expensive and most published architecture of our day, tends towards this complete dissolution of form into translucent gossamer wings hovering in 250,000 square feet over 40 to 50,000 square feet of simple boxes. Architecture these days has to figure out what it does with buildings. And I have to tell you, I think that this is probably the most important building being built today. It's probably the most expensive building being built per square foot. And it's the building that sums it all up. It's the omega of current architecture. It's the Apple headquarters, right? By Norman Foster. It's the perfect panopticon with thousands of Appleoids running around their Dilbert tracks that never end because it's a complete circle, always moving around that unseen middle where no doubt Steve Jobs is buried but still looking out at all of them and controlling the world. This is how architecture can both represent what it was commissioned to do and find a way to continually slide away, elide those meanings, come up with something that is perfectly absolute and yet so vague that we have no idea what it means. But this is much more important. This is what's actually happening to buildings. This is the Apple Store in Grand Central Station. Now, Grand Central Station in and of itself, as I'm sure you all know, is an interesting case study in the dissolution of buildings in the early 20th century. Even though it is a grand Beaux-Arts palace, built according to all of the principles that have been taught at least since the end of the 18th century, maybe since the Academy was founded in 1668, has all the columns, has all the pediments. It is a building that is torn apart, not just by the trains running underneath it, but by the cars moving through it on the second level, and by the instability of the ground plane that lets people move between all of those levels. And then, in a corner, there is a new building, a new store. Except there's nothing there. There's no doors, there's no ceiling. There is only a set of tables that they fill every morning with a bunch of things that you can buy. And you walk into this space, say that you want to buy that iPhone, and they take your credit card and your money disappears from where it never was anyhow. And they come out from some unseen cubicle in the back and bring you that little product. Where is the architecture here? Where are those pure forms in light? They, of course, have disappeared into this. They have disappeared into a technology that is presenting us with a profound problem, and that is that we can no longer see or understand how it works. One of the conceits of architecture always was that if nothing else, it created a structure that allowed us to understand the world through its particular frame. But when things have an existence that is virtual, when they are so small and so etherized that we cannot see them, when the object that contains them has become so condensed and abstract, what then is the role of architecture? And to put it in a grander sense, what is the role of architecture as a building when we are everywhere and nowhere? No matter how we torture our buildings, no matter how we try to figure out how, despite all of those codes and all of that value engineering, and despite all of the constraints on what we are allowed to build, how we can somehow make a building. In the end, if we make a building, what does it matter when you can be everywhere, nowhere? And to be a little bit more precise about our built environment, why make a building, and what does a building mean in a world of sprawl? Because the reality of our designed environment is the reality of sprawl. The concatenation of human dwellings from here to Timbuktu. The sense that the coalescence of built form into a series of hierarchical arrangements no longer stands. Sprawl is everywhere, from here to New York, from Shanghai to Guangzhou, from Dubai to Abu Dhabi, everywhere, it's always the same. It is a series of mass-produced dwellings. Don't let anyone tell you that architecture or buildings are not mass-produced. That spread throughout landscape like a cancer that is metastasizing the democratic grid with which America was once filled. It is filling it with these boxes of absence, these places completely fed by an invisible technology, by air conditioning and heating, by plumbing and water, that draw resources from untold places, creating a completely bland and mass-produced environment. These are essentially storage spaces for ourselves and our goods and our information. What allows us to find our way through them, what lets us know these places, what makes us at home in this world of sprawl, is not architecture, are not buildings, but are signs. Signs that tell us where to go, and signs that tell us what to buy. Now, My point is not that sprawl is evil and that it somehow must be or can be defeated, that we need to make better buildings than sprawl. My point is that sprawl is real and that we need to look at it hard and long and figure out what to do with it. And that's why I always love this particular photograph. I also love it because it was taken about 2 blocks from where I used to live for many years in Los Angeles. And it's, of course, a romantic version of sprawl because it's probably Sunday morning when there's almost no traffic and you can actually see the Angeles crest in the far background. But it is an amazing photograph because if you look at it, you begin to see the rhythms and relationships between the colors and textures and forms that move through and beyond buildings, that echo from a stucco wall to a Texaco sign, that bring your eye from a gas pump to a car to a doorway, that create a series of complex spatial relationships through which you can understand where you are in the world, that might even shelter you, that bring technology into focus, that create a social structure through which you can navigate and know your place. Maybe not the place you want, maybe not the place that you are even allowed to belong, but this kind of clear and careful looking begins to establish what I think are the building blocks of an architecture in sprawl, because this is what is evil. This is the other reality of sprawl, the reality of everywhere, always, Big Brother watching you. The world of sprawl is defined, and I define, as the world of modernity. The modern world that we live in, which is marked above all else by the continual movement of goods and people and information. In that world, nothing stays. Everything changes and everything moves. People move because they have to or want to. Goods move continually. Information is everywhere all around us. The way to establish security is to control it. The way to establish belonging, being at home, to be something within this world of complete continual change, that is exactly the world of architecture. It is a task that has to confront the deadly banality of the world of sprawl all around us. And it's especially true in these photographs by Joel Sternfeld, which are all images of places in sprawl where murder took place. Architecture has to figure out what it is when we by now realize that it's not just science fiction, that everything around us is a series of chemical and digital codes. What is it that we are going to construct? What fiction are we going to construct that allows us to inhabit this world of sprawl, this world of zeros and ones, this world of continual change? Well, the obvious answer, the easy answer, the answer that has dominated much of the, at least, scholarly side of architecture for the last 15 to 20 years, the answer that, according to Patrick Schumacher, would lead to the style of the 21st century and is the answer that he, as Obersturmbannführer, is going to impose on all of us, is, of course, to go with the flow, to understand that our world is nothing but zeros and ones, to try to mimic that fluidity, that instability, to create forms that are not possible without the various codes that the computer produces. Anything that you can possibly imagine, you can build. And when you don't know what to build, just let the computer, the algorithmic code, the succession of forms do it for you, even if it becomes no more than a cloaking or rethinking of fairly traditional buildings. You can even imagine that that way of thinking could lead to a re-architecting, a redesigning of the human body or of the natural world, or, what's probably more germane, the essence of that architecture might be the gathering, the collecting, and then the representation of information itself. These are two images from the Shenzhen Biennale, several biennales ago. That's Shenzhen growing from a small fishing village to a city of 12 million. But the reality is that what we use computers for and what the task that architects find themselves faced with is something completely different. So you can go with a flow, and you can create buildings without doors or windows that are almost uninhabitable, and you can in fact imagine a post-human world. That would be the one extreme, and I believe, and my argument with Patrick Schumacher has long been, that he is an extension, engaging in an argument that extends Peter Eisenman's argument that we need to build for the post-human. We need to realize that humanity is an artificial and dying idea. We need to do away with it, fuck the human being. We need to get beyond human beings and build for information itself. This is the other side of it, the other extreme, and that's comfort. That's the McDonald's version of architecture. The notion that at the end of this world of continual change, the movements of goods and people and information, at the end of the perfection of the pure forms in light, is the W Hotel. Is this completely banal and ugly accumulation of modern technology and forms that encases you in pure comfort, that accepts everything about how we think and how we think our bodies work. And I don't take this lightly. For any of you that have ever gone into a different time zone and woken up in the middle of the night having a hotel room where you know where the light switch is and where your glass of water is without having to grope around in the dark is an amazing thing. And I only say that half jokingly. There is a science, a perfection to this architecture, to the notion that the highest goal of architecture is to be comfortable, to make the contradictions, the fictionality of our world go away, to give us, if even for a moment, a sense that we are at home, that we can belong in the world. I could also have called it Zara modernism, because this, of course, is a probably more accessible way in which this kind of completely comfortable, bland, and mass-produced form of architecture appears everywhere. It's an architecture of a Miesian almost nothing, but a Miesian almost nothing that works perfectly, that makes a lot of money, that has perfect lighting, that allows us to all wear the same uniform and yet feel completely distinctively our own, that creates these stages that will allow us to act out the roles we would like to take on in relationship with other people. It is the best that architecture gets at making forms. And you can, I believe, take that further. I think that just as you could go with the flow towards zeros and ones, you can go with the dissolution of reality into something that yet is comfortable. And you can manipulate that very edge of disappearance. Just as I'm interested in that sitting on the ledge of those skyscrapers in Hong Kong, I am fascinated by those architects and artists, those people making architecture, who want to be right at that point where architecture seems to be disappearing, seems to not have anything to do with built form, and yet somehow something in that form remains. Its skeleton, perhaps. Its storage device for cars manipulated and deformed. This was a wonderful installation at the last Venice Biennale in the Belgian pavilion, where the architects and artists sociologists who made this show asked that simple question: how do people make themselves at home in the modern world? How do they take the mass-produced, standardized, meaningless objects that architects and planners impose on them and make them their own? They put in chair rails, they build in cabinets, they put in plants, they make windows where they're not supposed to be. They create something that is their own. And these architects said that is what we're going to make architecture out of. We are going to abstract, in true modernist tradition, those very moments of comfort, those ways in which we manipulate and make ourselves at home into an architecture. At the same Biennale, they installed the former home of the German president in Bonn, now unused, as this status object, this luxury symbol of state power, this sense that the most beautiful thing we can make is that thing that is right there at the edge of disappearing. An architecture that has that instability, that sense of scintillation, of continual movement and almost disappearance. Again, in the Belgian pavilion a few years ago, the firm Rotor asked the question, what is the essence of modern architecture? And their answer was that the essence of modern architecture is artificial material. If it is true that we as human beings have remade the world all around us, and you want to see what that statement means, you can go to the way we have physically remade our world in human-made materials. You will know linoleum, composite stone, and all the other weird veneers that you don't even think of and that you're sitting on right now. And they took fragments from that world and put it up as artwork, which is to say, as something for us to look at, to try to understand, and to recognize that somehow in use, something remains that is human, that we mark these artificial materials as our own through years and years of use. It's at that very point of disappearance, that moment where you ask, where is it? What is it? What is human in these kinds of installations, that an architecture begins to appear like a ghost, like a memory, like a sense of something that we know is still around us, that we see in the dark before we go to sleep in our W hotel, that we see behind the racks of clothes at Zara, that we see in the structures of buildings, that we recognize, in which we recognize somehow in this labyrinth of continual constructions and changes, ourselves like the ghost of the machine in this technology. Architects and artists are giving small pulses, small dots of light, small scintillas of form that shine in the almost nothing, or they are collecting forms and images from all around the world, conflating them into a single virtual screen, as Doug Aitken does, and beginning to ask the question, how can we make ourselves at home in this world of continual change, in this world where everything is disappearing? This is one of the most powerful projects I've seen in a long time by Doug Aitken, who took one of the worst crimes that an architect has imposed on the collective American psyche, which is to put this defensive pillbox of an art museum on the middle of the American Mall and then claim that it was an appropriate way to show art. And Aitken didn't tear it down, didn't renovate it. He merely projected on all sides of it a project called Song 1, that people sat as if it was an outdoor movie and tailgated across the street, while images from all across the world of sprawl flitted over the screens, bringing together the kinds of places we barely remember but all know, the things that we're not aware of but that we see everywhere, the signs and the images and the sounds of this world. It was a haunting refrain sung by hundreds of different people, always the same song, all about how this one form reminds me of you. And in that singing and in that collection, somehow form disappeared and a humanity began to appear. The best way in which you can begin to create a notion of architecture in a world of sprawl, in a world in which it is so difficult to make form, is sometimes not to make form at all, but to create a ritual, like Richard Rangier did when he started cooking Thai meals and called that his artwork. To create temporary constructions, erecting a whole bunch of umbrellas on a plaza in southern Korea. To stage a car crash in the courtyard of the Hermitage Museum. Or, in one of my favorites, to bring the traffic cones that denote the continual construction that is Shenzhen, always building itself, always creating new roads, and occupy their version of Tiananmen Square, their great and bland place of power, their expression of architecture as grand form in front of all of these towers of capitalism, to create a maze, a place, something that even temporarily gives an answer to all of these boxes of absence around it. And sometimes it's just as simple as giving all of that the finger. What interests me is how architects are beginning to reimagine not a utopia, and not claiming that their pure forms in life are promissory notes to the construction of that utopia, but are beginning to understand that what they need to do is misread, misunderstand, deform, represent, reuse the world all around them. That architecture today is a question of not accepting the reality that we've been given, to finding other combinatory possibilities, of not going to nothing, not going to zeros and ones, but to manipulating what we already have. I like to say that I think we have all too much Rhino and Revit and SketchUp architecture. We need more Photoshop architecture. We need an architecture that doesn't pretend that it's inventing new forms that wind up looking like everything else, but that deforms and reuses and conflates the forms that we already have. I'm showing you here a couple of projects from SciArc. We need, as architects, to learn from those stage masters and artists who have begun to realize that in a world of fakes and in a world of continual change, it is up to us to unseen a new reality. I said briefly before that what we want to do in architecture is to create not just a sense of belonging in the sense of disappearing into our dead, but to create a stage on which we can act out the roles that we think we need to play in relationship to our fellow actors. And to create such a stage, we need to create, above all else, the stage sets. And the kind of architecture that interests me is how the architecture that begins to ask how we can create those kind of stage sets. This is, for me, probably the most intriguing and interesting building that I have seen in a long time, because its status is so questionable. So, Winnie Maas grew up in a small village in rural Netherlands and was called back and asked to design a mini-mall, essentially a mini-mall in this village, on the main public square along the main drag. The way that he approached it was to work with a very good photographer who took photographs of all of the farm buildings in the area around it, hundreds of photographs, And they then conflated all of those images to the perfect, typical, standard farm building of Schrandel, the name of this village. Of course, that building doesn't exist. It is notional. It is encoded in our notion of what it is. It is the archetype that has no existence. And they then gave it no existence. They printed it on glass, blew it up 140% so that its relationship to our body and to use becomes unstable, and then put all of the functions within it. It's a building that makes you question whether it is really there. It's almost nothing that is already way too much. It is something that is comfortingly familiar and yet hauntingly strange. That sense of following all of the rules that tell you where to go and what to buy, and displacing them, misreading them, replaying them, is at the work of artists and architects like Elmgreen and Dragsek, who restage the simple act of having a living room, or having a bed or bathroom, or in more elaborate ways create this complete scenario where you walk into a building, are accosted, asked for sex, asked for money, found wanting in many ways, and then confront this completely typical apartment building that is completely fake, and find within it scenes of people arguing, having dinner, or this lonely teenage boy asleep next to his guitar and his page from Adam for Adam. And one of the interesting facts was that his fictional page got so many hits that for a while he was the most popular boy in all of Europe, even though he didn't exist. And I don't mean to say that these kind of fictions are only whimsical and are only there just for the sake of escapism or critical commentary. What interests me are people like Theaster Gates, trained in urban planning in his undergraduate degree, spent 2 years learning from a master ceramicist in Living Treasure in Japan, came back and got a degree in divinity, and then became an artist. And as an artist, urban planner, ceramicist, activist, began collecting all of the detritus in the poor neighborhood of Chicago where he lived, and used it to tell a different story about that place, to set a different scene he called the Dorchester Project. An assembly of everything that that community was, from the way it was built and the way it looked, to its collection of copies of Ebony magazine, from the magazine that was originally published there. Theaster Gates has gone around the world now, teasing out from what is around us what it could be, singing it alive, quite literally, with his group called the Delta Monks, who create performances within these places, scratching at the surfaces to find some stage in which we can act out our world. More and more of the kind of architecture that interests me is the reassembling of the bits and pieces of the buildings all around us into a new form, into the beginning of a new kind of community, into something that hovers between the leftover that it was and the new place it can become. That is ornament and structure at the same time. That's a bunch of discarded toys and graffiti combined with building elements. That is an explosion of the fragments out of which architecture was once made and could be made again. That deforms and reforms our reality so that it can be inhabited in a better, more socially just way. That is a replaying, a playful rethinking of our world, as in this crazy set of Cars and Trains by Chris Burden at LA County Museum. Not a utopia, not even a proposal for built form, but a toy, a miniature, a version of our world sent helter-skelter. It is, of course, also a reuse. And I think that one of the first things we have to do as architects today is when a client comes to us with a commission and says, I need a new building, so many square feet, this is the budget, here's the site, is to ask the question, do you need a new building? And why do you need a new building? Could you use a building that already exists, of course, is the first question. But the second question is, do you even need to do that? Or do you need to rethink how you live, or how your business works, or how your institution works? Do you need an architecture that transforms your stage set rather than do you need to use up natural resources to create a building? And if you are going to make a building, then use leftover car seats and tire trucks to create an art center. Or, and this is the work of a group formerly called 2012 Architects, now called Superuse, I believe is their new name, where they use everything from leftover kitchen sinks to washing machines and create harvest maps that allow you to find where you can harvest these pieces and bring them together into architecture. Architecture should be junk. It should be the assemblage in a thoughtful way of the stuff we thought we no longer needed, that is filled with the memories and the patina and the form of everything around it. Architects should be hunters and gatherers who collect and bring into unconcealment everything that is all around us, who reveal the potential form, the potential structure, the potential beauty of everything that is around us, who perhaps even take a whole bunch of 5 and dime pieces and set them alive with piezoelectric energy harvested from the sweat and electricity of people moving through the building. Architecture is taking the Hawaiian shirt that the guy's wearing, the bus that's going back, and all of the facades and assembling them into something that is cantilevered out beyond the built form of today. Maybe it's even just a whole bunch of dust that is made through electrical energy to cohere into something that resembles a building. It's an assemblage, a rethinking, a collage, a deformation, a purification, if you will, but certainly a condensation of everything that is all around us. I think especially that there are a group of architects who have rediscovered the idea of collage. The notion that we have an alternative to the canonical modernist tale in painting and sculpture and graphic design and industrial design as well as architecture, that everything tends towards disappearance. Theo van Doesburg famously said that first painting will disappear, and then architecture will disappear, and the spirit will be unloosed. If we don't want to disappear as human beings, if we don't want our world to disappear, we can assemble it, we can find it, we can cherish it. We can, like the artist Mike Bradford, go around our neighborhood and take the signs that are posted there for everything from hair weaves to lost dogs, put them on a canvas, cover them with automobile paint, scrape away that paint, put more canvas on it, scrape it away again, put more paint on it, until he creates a densely layered map of the world all around him. Architecture as the assembly of everything that is all around us, as in this piece called The Deathless Aphrodites of the Spotless Mind. In the work of Sarah Say, these globes that hover right at the point of dissolving and yet somehow create place and space, create social environments, create stage sets, create rituals around which we assemble. Work that might not look beautiful in the conventional way that we think of beauty, that might not look comforting, but also that does not dissolve into zeros and ones, that aggressively asserts the materiality and the potentiality of all the things around us. It can be as simple as taking the rubbish heap in a municipal park in Munster, Germany, as Pierre Heeg did, and planting hemp plants and rearranging all of the elements that are already there. The only new piece he made was an existing copy of a classical sculpture that he covered with a beehive, so it was always above. And then he assembled the paving stones that were going to be used for future construction to create a place where a poet could declaim or he could hold forth on what art was. Architecture as the marking of place, as finding new perspectives, as constructing moments where you can figure out where you are and what is all around you. Architecture that is about scraping at the walls, that is about doing almost nothing. Not something particularly new. When I first went to see Frank Gehry's studio in the early 80s, he took me aside and showed me the model for the temporary contemporary, which was a renovation of a car barn he was doing in Los Angeles. And he took me aside like he was telling me a great secret. I later found out that this was an act he did with every visitor, which somewhat diminished me. But he took me aside and he said, "Don't tell anyone. I'm not doing anything. All I'm doing is following the codes that told him that he had to cover part of the walls with a fireproof material and create ramps. And other than that, he just left what was there." He, like so many people since then, reassembled existing materials, reused what was already there, piled it up in a different way. Our new centers of urbanity, the new state sense around which we are creating communities and alternatives to endless sprawl, are the places formerly used for production, factories, that are turning now into places that are places for art, places for community, places for gathering. Now, I don't want to be romantic about this. They're still architecture, which means they're for rich people. They are a reaffirmation of social conditions that are divisive and far from just. But they begin to show the way towards the opening up of the boxes that imprison us everywhere as we live and work and play. They are beginning to show that we can take what has been given to us and mess it up. Not just reimagine it, but make it dirty and beautiful at the same time. Find a way that the world of production and consumption that seemed to have it completely caught in its deadening cycles that also are depleting our universe can be broken open. I've worked with my own students to find ways in which we can make an architecture not by creating new buildings, but by reusing old tunnels to grow psychedelic mushrooms and creating swimming pools within unused churches, turning former Kroger buildings into a combination of art storage and basketball field and market. Thinking of our culture institutions as the continual assembly of data in ways that keep moving and never sit still. This is one of my favorite projects that illustrates that what I think we need to do today as architects is hunt and gather and steal and reuse. This is a McKinley and White plan clad with a Cristo, nothing original, everything stolen, turned into an art center surrounded by a haven for feral cats. In order to create architecture today, we need to get rid of the notion that it exists in heroic buildings, which also means that we need to get rid of the notion of the heroic builder who invents out of nothing. We need to think of architecture as rebuilding our cities, maybe literally, as in this giant ceramic model I had, porcelain model, I had students do of Cincinnati. We need to think of architecture, and this is work of not my students, but students in London, as the assembly and redrawing and drawing out of the world all around us. I love this project for a club, a new gentleman's club, in which all of the traditions and history, as well as the physicality of the club, its structure, its material, its woods, its doors, its tables, all come together into this drawing of what everything is on the hand of the ancient man reaching for the doorknob of the club that will never exist. We need, in other words, not to build, but to unbuild, to open up, to reveal and reuse what we already have. We need not to represent and clarify, but to blur. We need not to make monuments, but to create unstable structures. We need an architecture that helps us see what is otherwise hidden, that articulates the technology that is occluded, over which we have no control, that scrapes away at the things we take for granted every day, that brings in that which is hidden and forbidden and illegal, and makes that central to the world of architecture. We need to understand the absurdity of the incredibly expensive and useless convolutions of the heroic architecture all around us. We need to peel away at architecture to understand that the flat and abstract white wall has a presence, can be articulated into a form all its own. We need, as I've said before, to make ourselves at home in a world of sprawl. We need, like Robert Rauschenberg did, to take the bed that he and Jasper Johns inhabited, hang it on the wall, and turn it into art, which is to say, we need to take what we use, what we know, what we make our own with our body, and through our social relations and our rituals. We need to see it, we understand it, and make that into the thing that allows us to really inhabit and be at home in the world. We need to create those enigmatic objects that are not symbols of perfection, but of imperfection, like Frank Gehry's fish lamp, made out of broken pieces of formica. It recalls his youth of Friday evenings when his grandmother would buy a carp and he would play with this beautiful animal in the tub every day until she took it out and killed it and turned it into gefilte fish. Beauty that is killed, reassembled as a lamp that to him is an emblem of what he wants his architecture to be, and is at the same time, as he says, a slippery, smelly fish. Architecture that is a catalyst that you can't quite figure out, that changes what is all around you. Architecture that confronts a world that is falling apart, that is turning into a dystopian environment through exactly the acts of construction, through exactly the architecture that replicates all of the imprisonment all around us. We live in a world that it is increasingly difficult to figure out. We need projects like are being shown right now at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in the Uneven Growth exhibition that propose ways in which architects can take the elements of everyday life in this corporation called Veranda and use them to make this mass-produced world our own. We need to assemble the trash of Hong Kong and all the different people that come together there and propose floating islands that would extend and alter sprawl into a different set of social relations. We need to figure out how to use our technology to create places so that everyone can go to school, so that communities can handle the natural devastation that we are wrecking on the world all around us. We need an architecture that rewrites the script, that rethinks the world as we have it today. I'm right now working on a book on urban think tank. Alfredo Brillenberg and Hubert Klumpner, originally from Caracas, now in Zurich. And I'm also doing the Shenzhen Biennale opening on December 4th. I invite you all to come. That asks exactly these questions. What can we do with this world that we already have? And the Biennale is called Reliving the City, inspired to a certain extent by urban think tank's experience in the Torre David. Some of you might know it from Homeland, in this dystopian version, where people took over this failed and half-completed skyscraper and began to inhabit it, began to make it at home, themselves at home in it, began to figure out how to make a community within that space. And it was up to the architects to figure out what they could do within that role. The architect is no longer the form giver. The architect is the person who finds the form within the community. The architect is not the master planner. The architect is the guy or the woman who figures it out. The architect is the magician who transforms a world of injustice and trash and misuse into something else, something that might even be beautiful. Now, I want to end by, first of all, giving an advertisement, and second of all, saying that I don't mean to say that all architecture should look like trash, that all architecture should be ugly, that our architecture should be difficult or confrontational. What I want to say is that the best and most interesting architecture is always an attempt to try to figure out how you can be at home in a world of continual change, both on an immediate level, how to create a hearth, a sense of belonging, a sense of a social unit within a continually changing environment, and on a larger level, what we sometimes call urban design, in terms of beginning to figure out how, as architects, we can use our knowledge to figure out how to work with, remake sprawl, so that it is more sustainable, more democratic, as Frank Lloyd Wright would have called it. How we can create places of wonder and light, and how we can create places that are stage sets for a celebration of a sociality that breaks through both closed form and the hierarchical structures all around us. How we can create structures that spiral out into the unknown, out of what we already know. I am taking off for Taleisin, which is still today a commune, a community, half in the desert in Scottsdale, half out in the hills of Spring Green, where a bunch of people, students and faculty and hangers-on, are trying to figure out what architecture is made of, where the task is not to create more boxes, not to figure out how you can become a registered architect and build the blandest, most boring buildings in such a way that you can make as much money as possible. If you want to do that, more power to you. This place is not for you. But if you're interested in architecture as an experiment, as a way of trying to figure out how you can make our world better, I invite you to come see us sometime in Taleisin, and I invite you to keep experimenting. Thank you. Sure.
We open the floor up to some questions.
Yes.
So I was thinking of the Tower of David, right, in Venezuela,
Yeah.
the whole time you were giving your talk. Because at some point, about halfway through, I thought to myself, why don't we just finish the experiment and then just hand over the built environment for complete appropriation by the people,
Okay.
and step out of the way as architects?
Okay. I step out of the way might be one way of putting it. My question would be, and this is what, and quite frankly, I don't quite know how they have done it or are doing it. And as you might know, Torre David is now being emptied out by the government. But it's not a question of stepping out of the way. It's a question of asking yourself the question, what skills and knowledge do I have? What have I seen that will allow me to play a role in this community? And you can do that in a favela, and you can do it in these very extreme situations. But what I'm trying to point out is that you can do it in any situation. That the question for an architect should always be not how do I make a bubble diagram, but how is my knowledge and my perspective appropriate? What can it do in this situation to fulfill whatever agenda you think is appropriate? I try to articulate what my agenda is. So it's not a question of just getting out of the way. It's just figuring out what is the right thing to do.
Okay.
Aaron,
Yes.
thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
I admire your call to arms. I guess the question I have for you is, where do you see the architect's real agency in all of this? Because we do know, and you admitted this yourself in the beginning of the presentation, that the forces that drive production and that are in many ways responsible for the sprawl that we're talking about are pretty powerful things. We're talking about the banks, we're talking about the Wall Street, we're talking about all of those powers that in many ways lie beyond the means of an architect or architects. So where is the real agency in all of
It's a good, it's a follow-up to the last question in a sense, and you're absolutely right. In fact, Frank Lloyd Wright late in life turned into a fairly dystopic guy, blaming the big banks and the Jews on everything, and sort of retreated to making things based on flowers. That's a bit oversimplification, but there was that sense that he withdrew in that experiment, something that I want to open up. What is the agency? To go back to the previous question, is exactly to figure out what it is that you can do. And I've tried to show examples of things you can do. Some of the things you can do are what people call art. You might say, well, that's useless, and no one can live in art, and what a waste of an architectural education. My point would be that what we call art in our society is things that are useless but beautiful, but if they're really good art, have the power to transform our world, have the power to make us not only think and see, but even live in a different way. That's at least why I love great art, and why I think we value great art so well. But you can also work in very specific ways. There's a whole world by now called tactical urbanism, and I've shown some examples of it, in which, and I'm busy with my students right now trying to catalog some of the many techniques that you can use in a community to have an agency, to have a particular power. You can also be, if you will, more standard about it and work through the system and figure out how to subvert the system, which is, I suppose, what someone like Rem Koolhaas would claim that he's doing, whether you believe him or not. Oh, sure, yeah, to a certain extent, yeah. So I think, in fact, that the forms of agency are everywhere. What I'm trying to figure out is how we can get beyond how we work. How we can stop thinking that the only way you can be a real architect, that your only agency is to make the biggest, most notable and unusual building that will last the longest. For me, that's not winning the game. For me, winning the game is figuring out what you as an architect can do to make the world in some way better. And some people retreat and try to make beauty in one place in the desert, and some people, like Urban Think Tank, set up a card table in a favela and say, okay, here we are, we've got certain knowledge, here's our lemonade or Kool-Aid, and what is it we can do to help? So I think there's a lot of possibilities for agency. Yes?
Oh yeah, thank you for making me reevaluate why I chose to study architecture. But I have two questions for you. So to what extent do you think that
Mm-hmm. Very, very good questions. First of all, I think that architecture does not end when you've created shelter. It starts. So the first thing is that architects should, like doctors, do no harm. And more than that, the first task of an architect, if they're going to make a building, which back to our previous discussion, might not always be the best use of your architectural talents or knowledge, but if you're going to make a building that stands up, that provides shelter, that does everything a building's supposed to do. Then make it into architecture. The work of architecture starts when you have fulfilled the requirements of the code. And it's very difficult, and that's why I said sometimes it's easier and maybe better to make it beyond or outside of buildings. But if you're going to make architecture out of or with buildings, then that work starts after you have provided and the basic needs have fulfilled the basic requirements of making the building. In terms of your second question, I think it's an excellent one, because I also think that one of the issues is that we have baked into the notion of architecture that we should make buildings that last for the ages. And to me that's absurd, because for the very simple reason that almost every building, as soon as it's finished, is changed and reused and altered. There's almost no building that functions the way it was intended, even in design development, let alone before that. We continually are adapting and changing buildings. Not only that, but creating buildings that are monolithic make very little sense in a world of modernity that is defined by continual change. I think that instead, we should think of buildings as the assemblage of materials in a way that is appropriate and in a manner that those materials can be disassembled and reused and changed and altered in any way possible. It's interesting, the environmental code in Germany, and now it's beginning to come in America as well, understands that the use of energy should be measured not just in terms of what it takes to heat and cool a place. We've gotten beyond that, and we're beginning now to look at what it takes to produce the building in the first place, which is usually tremendous. So you can create a net zero building, but if you have had to decapitate a mountain in Borneo to do that, maybe it's not such a good use of resources. But the next stage is also to understand what the rest value is of the buildings. Sorry, that's a Dutchism or Germanism. What the remainder value is of the building. How much energy it will take to adapt it, change it, tear it down, whatever needs to happen to the building as uses change. On a completely different theoretical level, I think, again, because our world is marked by continual change, thinking of the model of architecture as being that of a tent rather than a primitive hut or a temple might be a much more useful model, understanding as architecture a kind of prosthetic that allows us to inhabit our world by assembling a certain amount of technology and aesthetics into a form that allows us to be at home in that world would be better than trying to continually create permanent structures that we have to alter or tear down. Yes?
I really enjoyed the talk, very provocative, lots of promises. Here's a characterization, tell me what you think. It's sort of a whole earth catalog meets relational aesthetics. So it's this kind of countercultural consumerism, or countercultural mode of being a consumer, and a justification of architecture that always situates it in the construction or the enervation or the manipulation of social arrangements. So, yeah.
Fair enough. I mean, that's probably pretty close. I mean, I think that it's a few other things than that. But especially, yes, I'm very inspired by the the Whole Earth Catalog. I remember reading it like when I was a little kid and being continually fascinated by it. I guess I would say that I'm as much interested in collage as I am in relational art, because I do believe that there's something inherent about the physicality and not just the process of assembly, but the act of assembly that is what makes the difference between the work of art or the work of architecture and the work of performance or a number of other social actions that you can tell. So for me, the notion that it moves beyond a catalog or a process and becomes a set of spatial relations, however temporary, that it begins to establish a stage set or a structure of relationships is as important. So that would be my one, if I move beyond where we were, I would offer perhaps in that direction. Yes?
My question is more about kind of maybe culture, I guess. And so you make all these provocations about consumerism, but are any of us really ready to give up kind of all our items that we have, in the sense that I'm not ready to give up my 68-degree Fahrenheit heating in Syracuse. I'm not ready to give up my car, plane tickets, you know. And so in a way, how do you really motivate the masses to change centuries of culture?
I'm not, that's interesting, because I never thought of this as having to give up creature comfort, so to speak. And you're right, I mean, I'm as guilty as anyone. I buy too many things, and my carbon footprint is probably really, really horrible. Actually, I know it's pretty horrible given how much I travel. But my point is that we need to think not just in terms of this kind of do-gooder notion of giving things up for technology that allows us to live with a thermostat set at 68 degrees rather than 72 degrees, but we need to think about being able to do what we're already doing in a more logical and sane way. And I'm not sure it's that difficult. I'm noticing, it's interesting, and maybe I'm being romantic, but I'm noticing that friends that I have, or sons and daughters of friends that I have that are 16, 17, 18, are much less interested in the latest Prada suit that I might lust after, and are much more interested in the fact that they can find something really cool that no one else can find. They are much more interested in being hunters and gatherers and finding the luxury in that than they are in buying a brand or buying something new. And I think that there is a whole movement out there, the maker movement, and sort of the Brooklyn movement, if you will, which is also finding the luxury and the hipness and the desired point, if you will, in notions of reuse and remake and rethinking. So I don't think it's a question of educating the masses. I think it's a question also of reality, that we just can't continue to make stuff, and there is less and less stuff, and we can all afford less and less stuff. And I think that we are finding ways of transforming that we as architects need to figure out what our role is. That answers it.